Hey everyone! Today I'm sharing two cards using LDRS Creative's Autumn Breeze die set, Happy Fall, and Magic of Fall clear stamp sets. And I'm creating two cards to share with you today. They're very simple and it's basically a coloring technique of using colored pencils on cardstock. For the first card I'm creating today, I trimmed down a piece of craft cardstock at 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and this is a standard A2 card panel size. And I used the Autumn Breeze die through my Big Shot machine, and it's a really cool die because it cuts out this leafy background and also embosses on the leaves to give it texture. And I know that from the video you can't really tell, but it does leave really cool embossed patterns on the leaves, and that actually helps with the coloring as well. So for this card, I decided to use shades of green for all the leafy areas, and I'll actually lay down the darker green color in the embossed crevices of the leaves, and I'll also color the edges and outline of the leaves in the darker color. And I'll take that really light green into the middle, and I'll blend it out with the mid shade green. And I really like how this pops. The light green color really adds that dimension, and that dark green still shows up on the craft cardstock. So I'll continue to color and I'll play a little bit of music, and I'll return when I'm putting this card together. So once I finish coloring all the leafy areas, I'll go in with a blender pencil and smooth out all of the areas that I colored. I think that this really makes a difference because sometimes I didn't spend too much time blending the colored pencils, knowing that I'll use a blender pencil at the end, and it really smooths down the color and removes all the waxiness from the colored pencils. It also creates a more smooth texture to the images, and I think it really finishes it off. So I'll also go in with some browns for the branches just to give it an extra pop. It looks a little flat with the craft cardstock shade in between of all the leaves, especially since those were colored in. So I'll just go in and add that extra brown, and I think that that really helps with the card overall. So I actually stepped away from this card and then returned the next day, so you'll notice that the lighting's a little different. I usually film after work, and today there was a little bit of light still out, so I started filming and I picked up this card where I left off. So for the center of the card, I colored it in a little bit with the same brown that I used for the branches. And I'm going to use the oval shape of that die cut from the Autumn Breeze set to cut out a piece of craft cardstock. So here's where the lighting changes. So I'll go ahead and stamp the sentiment from the Magic of Fall stamp set in the middle of this. I'm using the color Coffee Bean from the LDRS ink line, and I stamped it on that centerpiece. I didn't really like how it ended up stamping because it looked a little cut off, so I decided to grab a new piece of craft cardstock, stamp the sentiment, and then die cut using the oval. And I think it looks a little bit better. It's a little slanted, but none of the letters are cut off, and I just add this to the center of the card. I think that this card turned out really simple and clean because the focus is the background and the colored pencils and the dimension that's added from that. To adhere this to an A2 card base, I chose a cream colored cardstock and I'm just adding a bunch of score tape and a bunch of glue dots to the back of this. And in retrospect, I probably should have just used glue, which I did in the second card, because there's so many little crevices that the glue dots just didn't pick up. And I think that I covered enough space where nothing will be messed up by not being glued down. But I do go back and add a little glue on some of the smaller leaf branches or the stems of the leaves. But to avoid doing that, you just want to use glue from the get-go. And I'll go back and do that, but I'll do it off camera. I really like how this first card turned out. It seems so detailed and pretty, and I personally really love how colored pencils look on cardstock. So much so that I decided to create a second card. The first card wasn't very fall-like, and that was my vision for the card. So I'm making almost the same exact card, except I'm changing up a few details. So obviously, instead of craft cardstock, I chose a dark brown cardstock. And instead of coloring in shades of green, I'm using shades of yellow and orange and switching the leaf colors. However, because I'm using a darker cardstock, my coloring technique changes a little bit as well. So instead of using the darker color for the embossed area and the outline of the image, I'm using a lighter color. For the interior of the leaves, I'm using the darker shade, and again, to blend it all out, I'm using a mid-tone shade. This helps the leaves really pop against that brown cardstock, and I think the effect of it looks really cool. So again, I'm going to leave you with a little bit of music while I color, and I'll pick back up when I'm putting this card together. So I forgot to mention that I'll be using the blender pencil off camera since it's just going over all the colored parts using the blender pencil and there's not much to see. I also forgot that I needed to pop in and let you know that I decided to stamp out one of the images from the Happy Fall stamp set using a white ink on craft cardstock, and I wanted to do some no line coloring. And this was a little hard for this image just because it was so small, but it fit perfectly in that little center oval, and I think it's so adorable. So I'm just going to be spending a little bit of time coloring this in, and the leaves were a little hard because they're so teeny tiny, but I think that it ended up looking really cute. So I'll pop back in once I finish coloring this image. So once I finish coloring up this image, this will be added to the center of the die cut background we colored earlier. I decided to use the same cream colored cardstock for the card base, and it just works really well with these fall colors. To adhere the die cut, this time I used score tape around the edges and glue all over the leaves and branches, and it made it so much easier and so much faster than the glue dots that I used earlier. So once I adhere it to the card base, I actually trim it down just a little because the cream cardstock was peeking out at the bottom. And that's okay, sometimes that happens. So that's it for the second card. I think it's my favorite of the two, probably because of the little image in the middle, but I do love both of them. And I hope you enjoyed these two cards and have a great day. Thanks for stopping by.